What happens when your AI coworker screws up and gets someone fired? Who do you blame? The algorithm, the programmer, or the manager who deployed it? In the last two episodes of AI Diatribe, Angela Mathon, Matt Konwiser, and I explored the AI revolution sweeping through businesses. But today we're confronting the question nobody wants to answer. When artificial intelligence becomes your digital teammate, who's actually responsible for what it does? This final episode of our three-part series is going to make every HR leader and tech executive rethink everything they thought they knew about the future of work. Let's dive in. You talk about models kind of going off the chain and doing crazy things, and we should turn this back towards the HR-specific discussion because this is a really interesting aspect of that, right? We all know that AI is very much in an augmentative role right now, and it certainly is growing in capability, and as it approaches that seemingly AGI level that we've talked about, maybe its capabilities get to be a little bit more and a little bit more. But now, where does the human being end as far as responsibility is concerned, and where does AI begin? And is it because we can see how the human is using AI and the effect that it has? Is the human responsible for what the model does, what the model says? Is the human responsible for the way in which they use AI? Are we talking about a loaded gun, and so the person that should be in trouble is the person holding the gun versus the gun manufacturer? You know, this is a real interesting landmine to start trying to go and walk through from a thought perspective. And so, Angela, from an HR perspective, because that is your province and that is the area that you work in very heavily, where do you see this going? I would be really interested to hear your thoughts, because we're talking about everything from agentic collaboration to, the way that to the way that AI is going to be used in specific workflows. How do you see this happening? How do you see this unfolding?
So I think it's probably a couple things that we already see happening with HR. So AI sort of showed up and it became a case of adoption. We turned on and gave a bunch of tools. A lot of companies kind of deployed the chatbots. And so, you've got a ChatGPT somewhere. And we turned around and said, yep, this is about a culture that's, modernizing in some form. And so HR is typically on the hook to think about culture or to measure it in some way. And also on the hook to sort of get a behavior change in some form. So I think it starts there a little bit. And then we turn around and say people are struggling to use the tool or struggling to do the thing. And so a learning initiative gets kicked off. We'll be trying to get people excited about how to learn to use the tool. So I think you tend to start in a space like that with HR. And I think where then it starts to get trickier, where HR starts to go, oh, is that still me? And so we turn around and say it's a teammate. Right? Because now you're building basically an agentic process that's a bit more sophisticated than what an HR team is typically able to handle. And so that's where it starts to become a bit, what does that look like? And so HR then needs to partner with tech. Because, it was fine when it was like the tool that you gave everyone, and I didn't really have to be too responsible because I was just getting people excited about tech. And if there's a tech issue, you go to tech and you raise a ticket. But if now we're turning around and saying it's a digital teammate, I now have to reimagine collaboration and culture in a way that is very much back in the domain of HR. And I think that's where then HR gets a bit uncomfortable now, because you've got to think about all the things you described, right? We've got processes for employee relations. And so it's very easy to say if a person does a thing, we know how to engage with the person. We've got processes and tools for how to do that. If you're engaging with an agent and, you've seen some of the cases where the dialogue of how some of these models are built gets into this like complicated space, we have to now imagine what that looks like. It's no longer just employee relations, it's employee agentic relations. It's suddenly, it's a very different dynamic. And I don't know that we're there yet. So I think HR is in a space of really trying to figure out sort of, if we are going to go down that path, what does that look like? Because it isn't just about the productivity, which is what the business may care about or what other functions may care about. They're having to think about the human dynamics around it. And I don't know that HR has fully thought about that yet. I don't know that every business thinks about using agentic solutions as teammates. But in companies where they are actively exploring it, I think that's where the conversation now becomes interesting of like, oh, wait, what does that actually mean? What does this look like? And I don't know that they know the answer yet, because I don't think they fully understand the technology even, apart from I logged in, I asked it a question, it did the thing. Now we're talking about a very different dynamic. There's an autonomous living thing sitting in an org chart somewhere, and we have to now figure out the rules around engagement. I think that's where HR
Well, and
is
that's
still
an
struggling a
interesting
bit.
perspective. Matt, it's really kind of, if you look at this from the perspective of the CTO or from even the Chief Artificial Intelligence Officer or the CIO, Mr. Field CTO person for the company that we shall not name because you're here on a personal basis and not as an official work occupation. but there is going to be a push and pull between HR and the tech executives here. And it's really interesting because they need each other. They need each other in a major way. The CTO doesn't have the people management skills or the ability to really kind of figure out how this is going to affect multiple disciplines and multiple culture points within a company, whereas the HR people may not necessarily have the technical acumen to really understand this and figure out how to implement this. So how does this play out? Are we going to see a future where the human resources officer steps up a little bit stronger and starts to understand the technology more? Or does the CTO kind of soften and become a little bit more people-centric? Or is it going to be some sort of a sliding scale in between?
So, I mean, my personal opinion is it's going to be a sliding scale, but both sides need to learn the other side's skills. I mean, think about something very common case, right? Large company, somebody needs time off. And the number of different processes that have to happen within the HR system to properly record it and log it, and then make sure that the employee has the right payment plans or coding structure during that time, and they're looking at expense reports and everything else during that time. If there's things that are due or overdue during the time that they're out, that has to be forgiven because they're out and not just choosing not to do it. There's a lot of automation and there's a lot of practicality that has to happen. But if you look at the reason why somebody's out, let's say they're out on bereavement leave, a human being might treat that request and their absence and what needs to happen during their absence and how they're handled when they return very different from an AI that is just simply trained to manage the HR process. And so the HR team needs to understand that when they implement AI, that it's going to be potentially very cold and very unfeeling and very stoic in its responses. And the CTO needs to understand that it's not as simple as just standing up a process to replace a workflow, that there has to be a very human element in the handling of that, because that's why human resources has the word human in the name. It's kind of a thing, right? Believe it or not, that actually is a real thing. And so, for example, for me as a manager, I've had people come to me with some serious personal traumatic issues needing time off, and we've not even put it through the system. I've just said, look, just, we'll handle it. Just go do your thing. Take 3 or 4 days, do what you need to do, come back. And then we've deflected everything that needed to get handled in the process. And it never showed up on their HR file, and it was never put in as formal time off or anything else. It was just the human thing to do. And again, going back to my, estimate on a Sunday, work on a Monday, no payment till the job was done kind of a thing. There was a relationship that was built through human interaction that conveyed trust and empathy in the situation that allowed two people to come to terms and get something done that was mutually beneficial. And that's really the whole job of HR, right? I mean, at least I'd like to hope so. That's kind of the primary purpose of HR. So I think that there's a lot of back-end orchestration that can happen within HR to simplify the process on behalf of the HR representative and the employees. But to just choose to completely replace everything, or to have HR not understand what the tech does and doesn't do, or the tech folks not understand how important the role of HR is for the H in HR, you're going to end up with a lot of problems. So it's got to be that union. IBM has very publicly gone down a path of implementing AI for a lot of its processes, and it has helped a lot of people. The net promoter scores, the opinion of our systems internally has gone up significantly as a result of it. There's been a significant simplification on the tech side as a result of it. So it can be done correctly, but to a point you made way back in the beginning, Jason, that we talked about last time as well, there's a tremendous foundation that has to be laid out in order to do that. You can't just decide to do it, not from a human resources perspective and not from a tech perspective. So that's my very long answer to that question, because it's not an easy one to address.
It's really not. And the common theme that I'm finding here in everything that we've been talking about is that humans selectively know when to be a little bit less rigid. And since all of these are tools that are meant for the edification and the benefit of human beings in the workplace, and ultimately companies that are run by human beings and are serving human beings. That's a really important element that we need to make sure that we're keeping track of. And another analogy that I might draw here is that it's really interesting and just follow me for a sec, okay? It's really interesting the relationship between the chief revenue officer and the chief customer officer. Okay, because it's once the sales process ends, now we have to transition to something that's a little bit more soft and a little bit more customer service oriented. There's this real give and take, push and pull between, the revenue organization and the customer serving or, customer service organization, because the customer service organization, quite frankly, is dealing with a whole lot of crap that's rolled downhill from what happened during the sales process. There may be unmet promises. There may be issues with implementation that the salespeople said were going to happen that really couldn't happen. Maybe there was misrepresentation of what the product or the services were going to be able to do. And so the chief customer officer or the customer service organization really, quite frankly, is in massive cleanup mode all the freaking time for revenue officers in just about every company out there. Now, it's a loose analogy, but Angela, I have to ask, we have chief human resource officers. Are we going to have a chief artificial intelligence resource officer in the future, or a Cairo? Is that going to possibly be a thing in the future?
Well, I think it's interesting. And again, I think it will depend on where the company's position is on AI. I think what's probably making it difficult is, the tech world, we operate better with a binary, a black and a white, right? It's just clear rules. And then you get into sort of the human side of things, and it's just always gray. It's always yes and. It's always two opposites can still be true, and yet can still be sort of something altogether, a third thing altogether. So I do think it'll depend on the company. I think what probably might happen is for companies that are actively thinking about creating sort of like this digital workforce and wanting human and AI collaboration, they probably would merge two departments together. So if I think about Moderna as an example, they might say to themselves, you know what, we actually are thinking that this is the best way to get value for our business, whether it's drug discovery or how we manage aspects of our supply chain or whatever the case is. So it might make sense for them to go down that route, and therefore they collapse them. I think your ServiceNows, for example, will just say, look, it's an add-on. And so the CHRO might have a bit of an add-on with their title. You might have companies like Microsoft where, you technically still have two CHROs just playing slightly different roles. One is on AI and one is on human. I think companies are trying to figure out, given their business models, like what actually makes sense when it comes to that kind of collaboration. Because I just think when you're sitting in an HR dynamic and you're looking at anything from like a recruitment process and how you think about talent selection, how you think about moving talent through the workforce and, placing talent in different aspects, internal mobility, how you develop. I just think there's so much gray in that. I would love to say, even though I've been in people analytics for a long time, that it's all scientific in terms of how we do talent selection and how we think about who gets the chair, who doesn't. But there's so many factors as to how you select talent, how you even develop it. People learn so differently at different stages in their lives. So it's a very hard place to create hard and fast rules. And I think that's what makes it really challenging with HR and AI, because it's like two very opposing forces trying to come together, and they're literally fighting each other on a daily basis, like question by question. So I just think it makes it for a very interesting dynamic.
Yeah,
I guess is the simplest way I could say that.
No, it's a very interesting
Yeah.
realm that we're moving into. And I say chief artificial intelligence resource officer. Some would argue that might be some sort of a middle ground between the chief human resource officer and the chief artificial intelligence officer. And like you say, there's going to be plenty of instances where there is crossover, but really the chief artificial intelligence officer may end up becoming the epitome of that the vast majority of time, because they're going to be the ones that are going to be managing most of these artificial intelligence entities that are doing these different things, right?
Yes. And I think how you manage like an AI agent or a process around it, it will look very different from human. So that's why I think it's also quite difficult to go to a traditional CHRO who got into the chair because they didn't like math in the first place. They were just very much sort of like, psychologists and social and all emotion and feeling, and say, we now want you to manage a workforce that has none of those things that you spent all this time studying, and help us make it make sense. I think it's just really tricky. It's a completely different skill set, and vice versa. You're going to go to someone who maybe came from a very sort of mathematical dynamic and have feelings, but maybe aren't leading with them all the time, and say you need to now get this particular thing that you've built to engage with humans who are like 95% emotion. So I don't know. I think it is really tricky. I think where the future is probably headed in the short term anyway, is the collaboration dynamic. What is the optimal sort of collaboration between humans and AI agents? What are the processes where it makes sense? What are the handoffs that actually bring some level of value? And I think you'll probably see experiments around that first. And then once you sort of figure out, maybe get some research around it, we've done a thing, we've tried it out for a certain amount of time and got a result. I think those would be the sort of proof points that allow companies to then feel confident saying, here's where we're now testing it, because we're fairly confident that it's going to more or less go in the direction that we want. I think right now we don't know. Everyone's sort of testing and playing and discovering along the way. There could be personality types that are better suited to engaging with agents and others. I just don't think we know enough yet. It's very much still, can you get the thing working in the first place? Okay, great. And then start playing. And I think that's what we're still in, that kind of storming and norming phase.
Yeah, no doubt.
Maybe more
a
storming
lot of
than norming.
storming going on right now. But you raise a very interesting point. And the thing that we've been talking about up to this particular point, and Matt, I'm not trying to leave you out of the conversation, but this is kind of an HR-centric thread. And I would very much like to ask this question of Angela and then have you give your thoughts from your perspective on Angela's answers. So here is my question. Up to this point, we have been talking specifically about how we would manage the impact that AI will have on the company from the perspective of the CTO or the tech officer managing the capabilities to the human resources officer managing how that might affect workflows and the way that people actually use it. There's a whole additional argument that we have not paid any attention to, and that is the cultural impact and the skill impact on the personnel in a company. And this is where human resources is really going to have to go through some major evolution, because they may have been bad at math in school, but by darn, they're going to really have to get to know AI so that they know how to prepare the workforce for the impact that AI is going to have on their roles and possibly help them transition into something where they can be productive rather than become absolutely obsolete. So what do HR officers do right now? How do they make this happen? Is this really something that they should be handling, or are we looking at something a little bit more in conjunction with a CTO, a little bit more of a hybrid role? What are your thoughts on that?
So I think what's more realistic is that, most CHROs aren't necessarily equipped necessarily to sort of, get in there right away and understand all the dynamics of AI. I think what's most likely going to happen is you're going to have to look at existing capabilities within the HR structure. So you might have your people analytics function, if you could afford that. And you might have some sophistication around teams that are already leveraging AI in particular ways. And maybe you're developing or sort of inviting them into that conversation. Or you're going to create a role specifically within the operations space where you're going to nominate a person to say, okay, we want you specifically focusing on sort of AI solutions, and they're identifying safe test cases or safe spaces in which they can actually test AI. Or you're just going to create a very specific sort of task force where it's CHROs and tech figuring out how they collaborate to actually test and engage. Because I think in the HR space in particular, it's really hard to roll something out. It's really hard to be behind something that you've got no sort of experience or evidence around. And so I think you've got to almost create a track record. So I think most companies are going to go down the path of let's create some proof points around what AI looks like or this collaboration dynamic that we're describing. And then you'll see sort of a broader rollout. So I suspect a lot of companies, and I know I'm working with a few, that are very much in the piloting phase. Let's pilot the new technology. Let's figure out where we pilot. Let's pick a pilot and design it in a way that's going to allow us to learn. So either it's an existing HR process or it's an existing talent selection dynamic where we're getting AI to be a bit of a recommendation engine. But you're just having to pick a very specific area to test and then test the culture around it. So not only did the AI work, what are the behaviors that came out of that? Is it aligned to your culture? Is it aligned to sort of your values, et cetera? And I think that becomes almost like a joint experiment that you share where you say, well, the AI worked, but we've then also got these other behaviors, and I don't know that we're excited about those. And so I think
So,
things
Angela,
have to come to
on
the
that,
table.
let me ask you something. How do businesses differentiate incoming people, especially younger generations that are more used to AI, grown up with AI, used it for school, used it for their home? How do they differentiate or filter out or create a selective candidate review process that separates people who know how to effectively use it versus people who use it as a crutch?
So it's interesting because I think in most companies, those digital natives that you're describing, they sit in lower places in the organization than your sort of senior leaders and some of your middle managers. And rightly or wrongly, most companies tend to focus on that part of the population first because they're usually more accountable for stuff. They've got sort of more responsibilities. And so I think that's where there's usually a tension point. So in some of the analysis that we tend to look at, you start to see that, there's a bit of a divide. And usually what you're concerned about is how you leverage that divide. But unfortunately, your digital natives are cheaper. And so you're not as upset or bothered by the churn. And they also are in a position to influence culture the same way, right? Culture tends to be, if you take something simplistic, like, what some of the leaders talk to describe, who you hire, who you fire, who you promote. That isn't necessarily what digital natives are doing. They're not in a position to do that. So I think the culture dynamic that you're describing is one of those things where we're aware and we recognize that there is individuals who can adopt the technology quite quickly and who can move really, really fast. But there tends to still be this sort of pressure point where they don't quite fully get the business. They don't quite fully have the experience of understanding the longer term plays and implications of things. And so it's a bit like, yeah, we know you're there. We know you can get stuff done. But there's also these other goals or outside of just AI technology.
So, the reason why I asked partially
anyway.
is because, Meta just announced that they're going to allow coders to use AI as part of the interview process now, right? So they're not saying it's a person on their own merits. And a lot of colleges, by the way, are forcing people to write code on pen and paper or pencil and paper for their exams because they're too afraid of the IDEs creating, help to help them kind of cheat their way through these things. But now Meta's saying, no, that's okay. Because I think back to Jason's point, it's more about the creativity and the critical thinking. It's how you work with the AI to solve the problem and not whether you get the brackets in the right places and define your functions with the correct names. So if that bleeds across to other functions outside of just simply developers or coders in an organization, then I think that the HR teams are going to have to fundamentally change their approach to interviewing and screening people to find folks and test them in ways that make sure that even if they're using AI as part of the interview process, that they're still applying creativity and critical thinking of their own, and it's not just AI doing it for them. Is that going to change things?
So I think it's a couple of things. I know HR is on the hook for hiring, but it's usually a requirement we're getting from the business. The business is saying, go find me X. So I think the question HR would have to ask is, what is it you're willing to pay for? Are you willing to pay for what you just described, which is the person who can apply AI to a situation, in which case, by all means, we create a recruitment process where that person could do that? Or are you paying for a different type of creativity, in which case we don't want AI involved? We want to know what this person brings on their own. And I think we would probably create a dynamic like that because it really goes back to that. So Meta might be saying they're happy to pay for a certain thing and therefore you can use it because when you enter the company, you'll be using it anyway. And maybe that's what they want to test for, and that's fine. Or you might be in a dynamic where that's not what you're willing to pay for. You want to pay for a different skill set. I think schools in particular, who are on the hook because you're actually paying them to learn a thing, need you to actually evidence that you walked away with something. And so I think that's probably why they're pushing for the, no, you can't use AI because otherwise I have no way of evidencing that I actually taught you anything. So therefore you need to just sort of pen and paper it. But a company might say, I don't really care what you're using because I'm willing to pay for the outcome. So if you can do it with AI and get me an answer really quickly, fine. But I don't know that either answer is appropriate because I think it goes down to our fundamental question earlier, which is the society we're creating, right? Do you want the person who just relies on AI all the time and doesn't develop critical thinking and so therefore they just get to an outcome and we're happy with that? Or do you want someone that still likes to challenge themselves, still likes to set and sweat and get the friction and all the stress that, we've all kind of gone through in thinking, but allows us to be fluid and agile mentally. And so it creates a really interesting personality. I think that's the other thing that makes it quite difficult is that I still value critical thinking. I still think there's value in being able to think on your own in some cases. So I think it's difficult, but I get it. In some companies, that's not really what you need. You want one brain.
Sorry, Jason, I just have to
people.
ask, what would be a good condition where somebody does not have to think on their own? Because you said in some cases, so I'm sorry, I have to know. What's a good example?
I just think when you're looking for consistent outcomes, right? And so you don't necessarily want adaptability. You just want people to always do the same thing, right? I think we've seen examples of that in companies. I think that's why it's
that's completely fair.
This is really good because this kind of goes into, we've been looking at this from a macro perspective. If we look at this at the personnel level, it really is a micro perspective. In other words, that could be role specific, right? Could the role require someone to actually be creative in the way they use AI, or do we not care how they use AI as long as what they're producing is adequate? And so for those positions where maybe the creativity, the critical thinking, and the communication skills are a little bit more important, I could see a time, and this is just me, pure conjecture, making crap up on the fly, but I could see a time where kind of a corporate equivalent of an ASVAB or an Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery Test might come into play for those different types of senior positions where we've really got to gauge whether this individual has the stuff to be able to use AI effectively in those different discipline areas.
Yeah, well, I mean, Jason, just very quickly on that. So the ASVAB is not unique, right? So in Brazil, for example, they have the vestibular, which is a placement exam that you have to take when you leave high school to decide what college you go to and what you're going to do for a living based on your aptitude on things. And I think they do the same thing maybe in Germany or France, where you kind of pick a major from middle school or high school, and then whatever that is, you're committed to it all the way through college. So if you decide you're going to be a basket weaver, then you are just committed to basket weaving. Like you don't do other things. That's your one aptitude. That's what you do. And I know the ASVAB, like if you score really highly, for example, you go to EOD or other things. It's based on your results, and your aptitude shows as kind of what branch you end up in and what your function is. So I think maybe it's just a broader, more even application of that concept, as opposed to just, the old, I'm undeclared for the first 2 years of college, right? Like, I mean, I don't know if that's the thing outside the U.S. Angela, maybe you have that knowledge from Europe, but
I think cultures are really, really different. I think that's why it's tricky, because in some cultures there is space for you to evolve and become a different thing. So, someone who spent a long time kind of playing one role, then play something else. And then I think there's other cultures where it's like, nope, you're this, and you can do all the other things, and that's a hobby, but you're just this. So I do think it probably depends a little bit, but I think from a company perspective, it's more around, like, again, it goes back to what are you willing to pay for, is typically kind of where your head is at. And so therefore I think that's going to influence a lot of the dynamic.
I hate to do this. I'm loath to do this. This is the worst part of my job as the host of this, but we probably need to wrap this up, and I might have to split this into 3 episodes, for crying out loud. This has been such amazing stuff, and I'm okay with that. But one of the things, Angela, that I would like to do, and Matt's familiar with this because I've done this to him, but one of the things I like to do at the end of my episodes is to ask my guests a very specific question as it pertains to their area of business practice. So if you, Angela, as a human resources professional who is also an artificial intelligence professional, if you were to sit down and give some guidance or some advice to people that are in HR, in companies, telling them what they need to start doing to get ready for this AI wave, or to make them and their company more able to incorporate and utilize AI resources within their walls, what would that advice and guidance be?
I think for companies who are considering implementing AI in their business in particular, and thinking about it from a CHRO or kind of HR perspective, I think the biggest advice is to sort of figure out the company dynamic or company culture that drives your business strategy. So irrespective of what AI looks like, if you are in a position where you can actually nail it and say the secret sauce, if you will, that makes our company work really, really well, is a certain type of collaboration, or a certain kind of specialism, or a certain kind of creativity or innovation, and whatever it is. If you can define it, openness or whatever the case is, but if you can really define it, then I think it helps you then figure out, how do I make sure that AI enables that AI supercharges it, protects it, whatever the case is. Because I think what you don't want to do is implement AI solutions that actually erodes at what makes you good and powerful and amazing in the first place. So I think if there is advice that I would share, is if you know, for example, that differentiation and innovation is a thing that makes you sort of tick and tie, then don't implement a solution that's going to erode the actual thinking and reasoning abilities of your workforce, because they're now all relying on a thing that's going to, over time, neutralize your impact. So I would just say to the HR person, spend more time being really clear on the cultural dynamics that makes your company really special, and ensure that whatever AI solution that you explore is preserving and protecting that, because I think that's where you're going to have
Matt,
more
any
of an
final
impact.
thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I fully agree with Angela. I mean, I think this is going to be constantly changing. The workforce coming in is going to change the culture ultimately in the companies over time. the way HR has to work with technology, the way technology has to work with people. This is all just a giant jumble in a cauldron, and we're still trying to figure out what the end product is going to be. And, Jason, I have to put this back on you a little bit too, because you bookend the problem. You are both a teacher now and a business owner that implements technology for other companies. So you are potentially creating the problem where your company may not be necessary anymore by teaching the younger people who enter the workforce to do your work for you. So how do you feel about this as well? Kind of working both sides of the equation here.
Boy, I'll tell you what, I'm just trying to hit everybody coming and going. I'm just looking to see if I can have an impact one way or another, in whatever direction I possibly can. No, that's a valid question, Matt. I mean, where does the line of responsibility lie? Am I creating jobs, or am I destroying them by teaching people how to utilize AI or incorporating AI within companies? Am I destroying jobs or creating them by teaching students about AI and how to use AI in their company, and what is the effect going to be on the others within those companies' walls? I don't know. I don't know the answer. All I know is that artificial intelligence is the single greatest disruptor, short of the asteroid that killed all the dinosaurs. This is going to be the single greatest disruptor of the world, I think, that we will ever see. And I'm not talking about just within our lifetime. I'm talking about over time. So it's going to be a very, very interesting next few years. All right, Matt, Angela, you are both amazing. Big hearts in both your direction. Thank you so much for your time today. You guys are wonderful.
Thank you, Jason.
And there you have it. Future episodes of AI Diatribe are coming that will feature more CEOs, AI thought leaders, PhDs, and even possibly the head of machine learning at a very prominent AI company. If you need help with AI strategy, need an AI speaker, or simply want to make suggestions on guests or content, reach out via any of our social media channels or via email at contact@aidiatribe.com. Don't forget to like, subscribe, follow, all the things. Thanks. We'll catch you next time.